60 years before the first Huey helicopters chopped through the humid air of Vietnam, the United States military found itself wading through the rice paddies of Southeast Asia, fighting an invisible enemy in a war that wasn't supposed to happen. The soldiers wrote home about the heat, the mosquitoes, and the constant, unnerving silence of the jungle, a silence that would be broken only by the crack of a Mauser rifle or the terrifying rush of bolo knives from the tall grass. They were fighting for liberation, yet the people they were liberating were shooting back. We often look at the Vietnam War as a unique scar on the American psyche, a moment where a superpower stumbled into a guerrilla quagmire it didn't understand. But history has a way of rhyming. Half a century earlier, across the same ocean, the United States fought its first true overseas counterinsurgency. It was a conflict of brutal ambushes, moral gray zones, and a death toll that shocked the world. This is the story of the Philippine-American War, the Vietnam we forgot. To understand how America ended up in the jungles of Luzon, we have to rewind to 1898. The mood in Washington was electric. The United States had just decisively defeated the Spanish Empire in the Spanish-American War. It was a splendid little war, as celebrations rang out from New York to San Francisco. As part of the peace treaty, Spain ceded its colony, the Philippines, to the United States for $20 million. But there was a problem. A $20 million problem. The Philippines had already declared independence. For years, Filipino revolutionaries had been fighting against Spanish rule. Their leader was the young, astute General Emilio Aguinaldo. When the Americans first arrived to fight the Spanish, Aguinaldo saw them as saviors. He believed the United States, the champion of liberty, the nation born of revolution against an empire, was there to help the Philippines do the same. He was wrong. President William McKinley, swayed by the era's fervor for manifest destiny and the strategic need for a foothold in Asia, decided that the Philippines was not ready for self-governance. He issued the Benevolent Assimilation Proclamation. The wording was soft, but the message was ironclad. The United States was here to stay. The tension in Manila was thick enough to cut with a knife. American troops held the city, while thousands of Filipino revolutionary soldiers dug trenches surrounding them. They stood eyeball to eyeball, former allies turned wary antagonists, waiting for a spark. That spark came on the night of February 4th, 1899. Private William Grayson of the Nebraska Volunteers was on patrol near the San Juan Bridge. In the darkness, he saw silhouettes moving. He shouted, "Halt!" The figures didn't stop. Grayson fired. That single shot ended the uneasy peace and ignited a war that would last for over 3 years. In the opening months, the war looked exactly how the American generals wanted it to look. It was a conventional war. Aguinaldo and his generals, particularly the brilliant but volatile Antonio Luna, tried to fight the Americans in set-piece battles. They dug trenches, formed lines, and exchanged volleys. But this played right into American hands. The U.S. forces were disciplined, well-fed, and armed with Krog-Jurgensen repeating rifles, backed by Gatling guns and naval artillery. The Filipino forces, brave as they were outgunned. They were pushed back, mile by bloody mile, north from Manila into the central plains of Luzon. By late 1899, the Filipino regular army had been shattered. Aguinaldo was on the run, fleeing into the mountains. In Washington, the generals declared the war effectively over. They believed they had broken the back of the rebellion, but they had only finished the easy part. Realizing he could not win a head-on collision with a superpower, Aguinaldo issued a new order that would change the face of the war. He dissolved the regular army. He told his men to return to their villages, to hide their uniforms, and to wait. The war of lines and trenches was over. The war of the flea had begun. This is where the Vietnam parallels become hauntingly clear. The American soldiers were no longer fighting a uniformed enemy they could see. They were fighting a population. The local storekeeper by day could be a guerrilla fighter by night. The terrain, dense jungles, mountain passes, and endless archipelagos became the enemy's greatest weapon. American patrols would march into the countryside, find a village that seemed peaceful, and then, on their way back, fall into vicious ambushes. Traps spiked with sharpened bamboo, sudden sniper fire, and bolo rushes demoralized the troops. The psychological toll on the American soldiers was immense. They were thousands of miles from home, fighting a war many of them didn't understand, against a people who clearly didn't want them there. In letters home, the idealism of 1898 began to fade, replaced by racial slurs and a hardening cynicism. As the frustration mounted, so did the brutality. If the enemy is everywhere, then everyone becomes the enemy. American commanders, desperate to suppress the insurgency, began authorized tactics that stained the reputation of the army. They implemented reconcentration zones, forcing civilians into guarded camps to separate them from the guerrillas. It was a strategy designed to starve the insurgency, but due to poor sanitation and disease, it led to the deaths of thousands of civilians. Reports of the water cure, a form of torture we now know as waterboarding, began to leak back to the American press. Soldiers would force water down a captive's throat until their stomach was distended, then stomp on it to force a confession. The violence reached its nadir on the island of Samar. After a surprise Filipino attack in the town of Balangiga wiped out an entire American company, General Jacob Smith gave an order that still chills the blood of historians. He told his men to turn the interior of Samar into a howling wilderness. He ordered them to kill everyone capable of bearing arms. When asked for an age limit, he said, 10 years and older. It was a descent into darkness. The splendid little war had become a moral catastrophe. Yet despite the ferocity of the resistance, the insurgency had a fatal weakness: fragmentation. The Philippines is an archipelago of over 7,000 islands, with dozens of languages and distinct cultures. Coordinating a unified national resistance without modern communications was a nightmare. The Americans, for their part, learned. They didn't just use brute force, they used attraction. They built schools, improved sanitation, and offered amnesty to guerrillas who laid down their arms. They recruited local scouts, Filipinos loyal to the U.S., who knew the terrain better than any boy from Ohio ever could. The end of the war didn't come with a bang, but with a daring cinematic raid. In 1901, General Frederick Funston hatched a plan straight out of a spy novel. He captured a courier and learned the location of Aguinaldo's secret headquarters in the remote mountains of Palanan. Funston didn't send an army. He sent a small team of Macabebe scouts, Filipinos loyal to the U.S., dressed as revolutionaries, pretending to bring American prisoners to Aguinaldo. The ruse worked perfectly. The scouts walked right into the camp, overpowered the guards, and captured the president of the Republic. When Aguinaldo surrendered and swore allegiance to the United States, the heart of the revolution stopped beating, while pockets of resistance, particularly among the Moro people in the South, would continue for another decade. The major war was over. The cost was staggering. Over 4,000 American soldiers died. But the Filipino toll was horrific. Estimates range from 200,000 to potentially higher, largely civilians who perished from famine and disease caused by the conflict. The Philippines would remain an American colony for nearly 50 years, until finally gaining independence in 1946. So, why has this war faded from our collective memory? Perhaps because it sits uncomfortably in the American narrative. It doesn't fit the mold of the good war like World War II or the clear-cut victory of the Revolution. It is messy, morally complex, and tragic. But the Philippine-American War was a crucible. It was the moment the United States stepped onto the world stage, not just as a republic, but as an empire. The tactics learned in the jungles of Luzon, the counterinsurgency doctrines, the winning of hearts and minds, and the terrible cost of fighting a guerrilla war were written into the military playbooks. 70 years later, a new generation of commanders would pull those playbooks off the shelf in a place called Vietnam, seemingly having forgotten the lesson taught in the Philippines. That superior firepower does not guarantee victory, and that the hardest enemy to defeat is a people fighting for their own home. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the hidden chapters of history, make sure to subscribe and ring the bell. There are thousands of stories buried in the archives, and we're going to uncover them one by one.